My name is Courtney Blake. I'm 34 years old, and until this morning, I believed I understood what family meant. I live in a narrow second-floor walk-up in Baltimore, the same building I've overseen for years, the same one my grandmother devoted her entire life to. In winter, the radiator sings its uneven song, the stairs groan under every step, but it has always been home to me and to everyone else who lives within these walls. Today, my sister walked in without knocking and set a folded notice down on my kitchen table. Printed on it, in crisp, professional lettering, was a new figure, $8,100. My rent for this same tiny apartment was jumping from $2,350 to more than 4 times that amount, because, as she put it, the market could handle it. She didn't need to explain anything. The smile she wore told me exactly how much satisfaction she took in watching me read it. An hour later, my parents called to tell me why it was reasonable. They spoke about opportunity, appreciation, investment, every polished term except the obvious truth that no normal person in this building could ever pay that kind of rent and survive. They said my below-market rate had been a favor, and that favors aren't meant to last. What they didn't know was that the faint smudge of ink beneath my fingernails came from a very different set of papers. For the past 4 years, without my sister or my parents realizing it, I'd been more than the woman fixing leaky sinks and jammed mailboxes. Because of my grandmother, I had been holding on to a secret that flipped this entire business decision upside down and turned my sister's power play into the first step of her own undoing. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're watching from. I'm curious how far this story will travel. By late afternoon, the weight of the day settled on me in a way I couldn't ignore. I picked up my phone, hoping for grounding from someone who had known me my entire life. But the moment my mother started speaking, I understood how uneven the ground beneath me truly was. Her voice carried a polished certainty, leaving no room for questions, only rehearsed assurances that change is necessary and that I should trust my sister to handle things the way successful people do. When my father joined the call, he mirrored her tone exactly, steady and dismissive, almost mechanical, as if the outcome had been decided long before I ever saw the notice. They weren't angry, not openly, but there was something colder than anger in the way they framed everything as progress and growth. The message was clear. I was the problem, not the one being crushed. I ended the call with a hollow ache in my chest and stepped into the hallway. It buzzed with restless movement, doors opening, hushed conversations, footsteps pacing across the worn wooden floorboards. News travels fast in a building like ours, especially when it threatens the roof over people's heads. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the stairwell clutching an envelope, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. She'd lived here most of her adult life, long before I ever managed the building, and the fear in her eyes cut deeper than anything my family had said. Across the hall, Mr. Novak leaned heavily on his walker, breath shallow, murmuring numbers under his breath like he was trying to solve a problem he already knew had no solution. Farther down, the Kim family quietly packed small toys into a cardboard box while their daughter asked questions they couldn't answer. There was no shouting, no chaos, just a dense, quiet dread heavier than noise. People avoided my gaze, not out of blame, but because hope itself felt fragile. They didn't ask who made the decision, they asked only if they still had time. I tried to reassure them, but the words caught in my throat. This was the first time I felt the combined weight of other people's lives pressing into my spine. I wasn't just losing something, they were losing everything, and somehow that responsibility felt closer than the blood ties I'd spoken to earlier. As the hallway slowly emptied, a soft knock sounded behind me. When I turned, Marian Flores stood at my door, posture firm, expression kind but purposeful. She skipped pleasantries and stepped inside, folding her scarf neatly as she studied my face with the clarity of someone who had watched generations of lives pass through these walls. Marion had known my grandmother well, far better than most of my relatives, and the certainty in her eyes told me she hadn't come for sympathy. She sat and spoke with calm precision, her words carrying the weight of long observation. She mentioned moments from years ago, sharp looks exchanged at holiday dinners, financial disagreements my grandmother never let fully surface, small choices that seemed insignificant at the time but now traced a straight line from who Whitney had always been to what she was becoming. According to Marion, my grandmother worried that the ambition my sister wore like a badge was slowly turning colder, more calculated. Then Marion said something that made the room feel tighter. She explained that my grandmother never trusted keeping everything important in obvious places, that she sometimes hid things where only someone who truly understood her habits would think to look. Marion didn't know exactly what those things were, but she believed they were meant for me. She spoke as if she were pointing me toward a door I'd walked past my entire life. Her tone wasn't dramatic, it was practical, certain. She believed my grandmother had anticipated a moment like this, not the details, but the inevitability of conflict, and had prepared for it. When Marion finally stood to leave, the helplessness in my body shifted into something sharper, not confidence yet, but direction. She touched my arm gently before she left, offering no promises about what I'd find, only certainty that my grandmother had left something behind because she knew I would need it. When the door closed, the building felt different, as if the floor beneath my feet was urging me forward. Morning came with a clarity that pushed me into motion before doubt could catch up. I went downstairs with a ring of old keys my grandmother had given me years ago, keys I'd never questioned until now. The basement door stuck in its frame, and I had to lean my shoulder into it before it gave way. Dust and old paint greeted me as I stepped inside. Nothing had changed. Stacked boxes from former tenants, abandoned cords, the low hum of the boiler vibrating through the pipes. Yet every shadow felt intentional, like the room knew something I didn't. I moved slowly, fingers trailing along shelves, guided by memories of afternoons spent helping Grandma June sort decorations and tools. She always said the basement was the heart of the building, messy, overlooked, but holding everything together. My hand brushed the edge of her old sewing cabinet, a squat piece she refused to discard even when the drawers stuck. I pushed it aside, revealing a narrow seam in the floorboards, too straight to be accidental. Kneeling, I pried the board loose. Beneath it sat a small weatherproof box, easy to miss, heavy enough to matter. My heart thudded once before settling into a steady pull urging me forward. Inside were folders bound with elastic, sealed envelopes, and a metal tin that rattled softly. I opened the tin first. A set of keys lay inside with a note in my grandmother's familiar cursive, steady even near the end, for when the time comes. The simplicity tightened my throat. She knew.
The first folder shifted everything. These weren't keepsakes or scattered notes. They were deliberate, structured documents spelling out the truth with chilling clarity. At the top of the first page, stamped and notarized, was the operating agreement for Blake Heritage LLC. My name was listed as the sole owner, unmistakable. My printed signature sat beneath it beside my grandmother's. She must have guided me through it years ago when I thought I was helping with routine paperwork, never realizing she was transferring the entire building into my hands. Another folder held printed emails in careful order between Whitney and Colin Reeves of Reeves Urban Capital. Their language was professional, strategic, unmistakable. Projected values, vacancy timelines, barriers to redevelopment. People like Mr. Novak and the Kim family reduced to obstacles on a spreadsheet. The most recent messages carried urgency, outlining ways to accelerate turnover in the building, and my stomach twisted as I read them. I forced myself to keep reading. One envelope held a handwritten letter addressed to me. The ink was faded and the edges had curled slightly, but my grandmother's voice came through stronger than any document. She wrote about her fear that the people she trusted wouldn't care for the building the way she had. She worried ambition would cloud judgment, and compassion would be dismissed as weakness. She wrote that I saw people as individuals, not numbers, and that this mattered more than anyone understood. Then she explained her decision quietly, without drama, to ensure the building's future wasn't left in the wrong hands. Her belief in me pressed heavily against my chest, both comforting and terrifying. I hadn't asked for any of this, yet she had placed her legacy entirely in my care. I closed the letter and sat back on the cool concrete floor, trying to steady myself. Nothing in my life felt simple anymore, but beneath the weight was a sharper, steadier thread. Purpose. I gathered the documents into a clean stack and locked them inside my bag. There was one more step I couldn't ignore now that the truth had surfaced. My grandmother had trusted a single lawyer with her estate, a man she respected for his precision and quiet loyalty. His name surfaced in my memory as clearly as if she had whispered it into the room. Daniel Price, and if anyone could explain the depth of what she had done, it would be him. I climbed the stairs with the box secured, my fingers brushing the worn railing she once held. For the first time in days, the path ahead felt less like a collapse and more like a revelation waiting to be understood. By the time afternoon settled in, the next step felt unavoidable. I drove across town toward a small brick building tucked between a bakery and a travel agency, a place I had never visited but recognized immediately from the name etched on the glass door, Law Office of Daniel Price. My grandmother trusted very few people with details she considered structural, and Daniel had been on that short list. The weight of the documents in my bag only reinforced the need for someone who understood their complexity better than I did. Inside the office, the reception area smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner. It felt orderly in a way that reminded me of my grandmother's handwriting, precise, unfussy, deliberate. A receptionist motioned for me to wait, and within minutes I was ushered into a narrow room lined with framed case summaries and community grants. At a wooden desk sat Daniel Price, who rose when I entered. He looked to be in his late 60s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a calm expression that suggested he had anticipated this visit long before I realized I needed to make it. I handed him the folders without preamble, watching his expression shift from recognition to concentration. He read quickly, each page turning with the assured rhythm of someone who already knew what he was looking for. My grandmother had prepared him, that much was clear. He paused at the letter addressed to me, letting out a breath that seemed equal parts sadness and admiration. Then he organized the papers into neat stacks, aligning the corners with care before speaking. His explanation came steadily, anchored in legal frameworks that felt foreign to me, but familiar to him. He described how the building's ownership had been repositioned years earlier, how Blake Heritage LLC operated independently of the family trusts my parents and Whitney believed governed the property, and how the agreement I signed had transferred authority to me without triggering suspicion. According to him, my grandmother built a structure with multiple layers of visibility, one public, one private, and one known only to the two of us through documentation she intended me to discover in my own time. She emphasized that the LLC granted me complete legal control over the building's operations, revenue, and future decisions. Whitney had influence only because she believed the old trust held dominance, but legally, she had no authority to impose changes without my approval. The rent increase she pushed forward carried no enforceable standing beyond intimidation. Hearing it clarified by someone outside the family steadied my pulse more than I expected. Daniel continued, outlining financial ledgers that documented recurring maintenance withdrawals under entities tied to redevelopment firms. The pattern suggested that money had been siphoned long before the rent increase ever surfaced. His tone never shifted into outrage, but the precision of his explanation made the implications even clearer. The losses were substantial enough to raise scrutiny from auditors, and the documents stored by my grandmother appeared to have been curated for the very purpose of exposing discrepancies. She must have anticipated how far Whitney would go, and collected evidence accordingly. When he finished reviewing the final page, the room fell into a quiet that pressed against my ears. Daniel folded his hands and explained that my next decisions would determine the building's future, as well as my family's assumptions about control. He spoke carefully about safeguarding records, documenting any interactions with Whitney, and preparing for the possibility that attempts to pressure residents might escalate. His advice was practical, grounded in years spent navigating conflicts between property rights and community welfare. I realized then that my grandmother had chosen him not just for legal expertise, but for steadiness, someone who saw beyond numbers. He reached into his cabinet and produced a binder labeled with my name. The binder contained a timeline she had drafted outlining stages of responsibility she wanted me to follow, if the need ever arose. It wasn't prescriptive, but it offered structure, a reminder that she saw potential in me before I saw it in myself. It also explained why she never confronted Whitney directly. She understood that exposure carried more weight when consequences unfolded naturally, rather than through argument. Leaving the office, the late afternoon light felt sharper against my skin. The binder rested in my hands like a quiet verdict, not against my sister, but against the assumptions that had shaped our family's dynamics for years. I walked toward my car with a clarity that surprised me. The building wasn't simply a place where people lived. It was a responsibility inherited through intent and foresight.
And whether I had asked for it or not, it now belonged to me in every way that mattered. By the end of the week, the tension in the building felt ready to snap. The hallways seemed to hold their breath as residents moved quietly between their doors. Uncertain what would come next, I sensed a shift in the air, the kind that precedes a confrontation no one quite wants, but everyone expects. That shift became unmistakable early one morning when loud footsteps sounded on the stairwell, followed by the hollow thud of clipboards striking against metal railings. I stepped out of my apartment and saw my sister leading a group of 3 men in stiff suits, each holding printed checklists. Whitney walked ahead with deliberate confidence, her heels clicking like a metronome, marking the pace of her intent. She didn't acknowledge me or anyone else in the hallway. Instead, she pointed toward units as if she were conducting an inspection she had full authority over. Her expression carried a boldness that felt manufactured for an audience, an attempt to project structure where none lawfully existed. Behind her, the men scanned the hallway with detached interest, their professional distance sharp enough to unsettle residents who peeked through barely open doors. Their presence created an atmosphere of impending judgment, and Whitney seemed to thrive on it. She handed one of them a folder and gestured toward the units on the lower floor, instructing him to start documenting conditions. It didn't matter that she had no legitimate right to do so. The performance was the point. But what Whitney didn't see, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that the building had already begun to recalibrate around itself. The night before, the community room had filled with residents determined not to be pushed aside. At the center of the meeting was Jasmine Lee, a housing counselor from a local nonprofit Marion had contacted. Jasmine spoke calmly, explaining tenant protections with a clarity that studied the room. She emphasized documentation, transparency, and the importance of recording every step taken by those who sought to intimidate them. By the end of the meeting, residents who had felt isolated were united by a shared understanding of what they were facing. That unity was visible now as doors opened one by one. Residents gathered in small clusters, standing with folded arms or hands gripping phones ready to record. There was no hostility, only a firm refusal to be dismissed. The men in suits hesitated at the sight of cameras pointed quietly in their direction. Their composure faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty, and one of them glanced at Whitney for direction. Her jaw tightened, but she pressed forward with forced authority, insisting, "They continue." The first inspection took place in Mrs. Alvarez's unit. She stood near the doorway with Jasmine by her side, offering silent reassurance. The men checked for non-existent issues, leaks that weren't present, wiring that had already passed annual reviews, structural concerns that had never existed. Whitney hovered behind them, waiting for anything she could twist into justification, but the apartment was orderly and well-maintained, the result of years of careful living rather than neglect. When nothing surfaced, Whitney's irritation became palpable. They moved to the Kim family's apartment next. The same pattern unfolded: cleanliness, compliance, nothing that could be construed as a violation. The men's questions grew shorter, their tone less sure. They completed their final notes and stepped back into the hallway where other residents watched with quiet resolve. Whitney's confidence thinned with each passing second, her plan unraveling in real time. By the time the group reached the last unit, the inspection had turned into a procession of empty findings. The men seemed eager to leave, and one murmured something to Whitney that she waved off without acknowledging. Her expression hardened into something brittle. She looked around at the residents, solid, calm, unshaken, and for the first time, her composure slipped. Without warning, she announced that the family would be meeting at Uncle Steve's office the next day to resolve structural issues within the ownership. Her tone suggested she was clinging to whatever authority she believed she still held. There was no explanation, no invitation for discussion, just an abrupt declaration she expected everyone to accept. As the inspection team filed down the stairs, residents dispersed back to their apartments in a quiet wave of relief. The hall regained its familiar stillness, but beneath that calm lay an undercurrent of something new: confidence. The attempt to intimidate them had faltered, and they knew it. I closed my door behind me and set the binder from Daniel on my desk. The inspection had revealed nothing about the building, but everything about my sister's determination to control it. Tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be about structure or management, it would be a reckoning, one she didn't realize she had already triggered. The next day carried a heaviness I felt from the moment I stepped outside. Clouds drifted low over the city, muting the morning light as I drove to Uncle Steve's office. The building stood in a business district filled with narrow streets and small law practices, the kind of place where paperwork held more power than personality. It seemed fitting for what was about to unfold. I parked, steadied my breath, and walked toward the glass doors, the binder from Daniel tucked securely under my arm. Inside, the office was lit with soft yellow bulbs that cast a subdued glow over the waiting room. My sister was already there, sitting straight back in a navy blazer, her expression sharpened into something between triumph and calculation. My parents stood near the windows, speaking in hushed voices that paused the moment I entered. They watched me with an odd mix of expectation and impatience, as though the outcome had been written long before I arrived. Whitney didn't bother hiding her confidence. She looked at me the way someone looks at a problem they believe they've already solved. Uncle Steve greeted us with rigid politeness and directed everyone into a conference room dominated by a long oak table. Folders were neatly arranged at each seat, and a pitcher of water sat untouched in the center. The atmosphere felt staged, as if the room had been preparing for this confrontation long before any of us stepped inside. I took a seat opposite Whitney and creased the binder on the table without opening it. My sister tracked the movement with a faint narrowing of her eyes. The meeting began with Steve outlining what he called structural changes to the property. He spoke about redevelopment potential, long-term gains, and the advantages of partnering with investors. His tone was steady, but every word aligned suspiciously well with the plans Whitney had been pushing. When she took over the discussion, she framed the building as a valuable but underperforming asset and presented a glossy packet filled with projected numbers. She described timelines, buyouts, and estimated returns, her voice crisp with confidence. My parents nodded along, clearly persuaded by the promise of financial gain. They emphasized that family unity depended on cooperating with Whitney's direction. The phrase rang hollow, like a script repeated out of obligation rather than conviction.
As they spoke, I watched their expressions, my mother's slightly forced optimism, my father's tight jaw, and felt a familiar distance settle between us. Their vision of family had always been built on hierarchy, and in that hierarchy, Whitney sat at the center. When they finished, the room grew quiet, as if waiting for my compliance. For a moment, their expectation filled the space more heavily than the documents on the table. Then I opened the binder. The first set of papers slid across the table with a muted rasp. I explained calmly that Blake Heritage LLC held complete ownership of the building. The agreement naming me as the sole owner lay at the top of the stack. My signature aligned beside my grandmother's. Whitney's confidence faltered. She stared at the page with a rigidity that bordered on disbelief. My parents exchanged uneasy glances, confusion overtaking certainty. Next, I placed the financial records in front of them, ledgers detailing withdrawals from building funds to companies tied directly to Whitney. The amounts were clearly marked, each transaction painting a clear picture of misappropriated funds. My voice stayed steady as I outlined the implications, letting the documentation speak where emotion held no place. The binder contained everything: maintenance charges that never reached contractors, consulting fees routed to shell entities, and recurring monthly transfers with no legitimate purpose. Finally, I set down the last file, the printed emails between my sister and Colin Reeves. Their conversations outlined strategies for clearing the building, accelerating vacancies, and positioning it for redevelopment. The language was careful but unmistakable, each sentence revealing more intent than the one before it. Whitney's face drained of color as the pages spread out like a map of her plans. A long stretch of silence followed. My parents looked stunned, caught between loyalty and the reality laid bare before them. Whitney tried to speak, but the words collapsed before they formed. Her composure had cracked, leaving only the raw outline of panic. This time, the quiet came not from uncertainty, but from the weight of evidence that left no room for denial. Then, a knock broke the silence. The conference room door opened, and Daniel Price stepped inside with a measured calm that shifted the room's balance. Behind him stood an investigator from the city attorney's office carrying a slim folder. The investigator introduced himself professionally and stated that he needed to discuss financial discrepancies tied to property management activities. His tone wasn't harsh, but it carried an authority that cut through any argument before it started. Whitney's reaction was immediate, a mix of disbelief and growing dread. She looked at each of us as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. My parents stood frozen, their earlier confidence vanished beneath a rising tide of uncertainty. The investigator waited patiently, holding the door open for her, and by the time she found her voice, the room no longer belonged to her. Weeks slipped by before the full weight of everything finally converged in a courtroom downtown. The building itself felt cold despite the early spring sun drifting through its tall windows, and the air carried the stillness of spaces where decisions reshape lives. I took a seat behind the rail, the binder resting on my lap, though I no longer needed to rely on it. Every document, every number, every quiet realization had already settled into my memory with unshakable clarity. This was no longer about shock. It was about truth stepping forward with nowhere left to hide. When the hearing began, the charges were read with clinical precision. They outlined patterns of financial misconduct tied directly to Whitney: withdrawals disguised as routine maintenance, transfers to shell entities she controlled, and coordinated efforts to shift residents out through pressure tactics. The prosecutor presented each piece of evidence with a calm certainty that left little room for interpretation. I watched my sister at the defense table, her posture stiff, her eyes forward. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if the confidence she wore so easily before had evaporated under the sterile lights. Witnesses were called. Mrs. Alvarez spoke about unexpected notices and the fear that grew in the hallways. The Kim family described the confusion their daughter felt when told they might need to leave her school. Even Mr. Novak, leaning heavily on his walker, recounted the sudden pressure placed on elderly tenants. Their voices carried not anger but exhaustion, the kind that lingers when stability is threatened by someone who views it as disposable. I was called last. The judge asked direct questions about my role, the documents, and the structure my grandmother had put in place. I answered steadily, aware that my grandmother's foresight had become a shield, not just for me but for the entire building. Speaking her name aloud in that space felt like placing a steadying hand on my own shoulder. The courtroom listened, not with sympathy, but with the kind of attention given to facts that tie everything together. When the arguments concluded, the decision came with measured firmness. Whitney was found guilty of financial misconduct and sentenced to a term in state custody that reflected the severity of her actions. The judge emphasized the impact on vulnerable tenants and the deliberate nature of the scheme. There was no outburst, no dramatic plea, just a quiet collapse in her expression, a recognition that the path she had chosen ended exactly where it was always going to lead. My parents approached me briefly afterwards. Their faces carried a complicated blend of worry, disbelief, and something that resembled regret but didn't fully reach the surface. They asked if I wanted to talk. I told them I didn't. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just a distance formed by years of choices far heavier than anything decided in that courtroom. They stepped back, and I walked past them without looking back. Outside, the air felt brighter than it had in months. The city noise filled the street, cars passing, conversations drifting from nearby cafes, a train rumbling in the distance. Life continued as if nothing monumental occurred, yet everything in my world had shifted. I headed towards the building, the one my grandmother had safeguarded through deliberate planning and quiet resilience. Standing on the sidewalk, I watched the windows reflect the late afternoon light, each pane holding the stories of people who had weathered uncertainty together. In the weeks that followed, I worked closely with Jasmine Lee to stabilize rents, arrange repairs the building genuinely needed, and offer long-term agreements to residents who feared displacement. Their relief wasn't expressed through celebration, but through small gestures, doors propped open to share warm air from kitchens, greetings exchanged with ease, a sense of steadiness returning floor by floor. I felt it each time I walked the stairwell, the creak of the steps no longer a reminder of pressure, but of continuity. Late one evening, I stood at the entrance and let the quiet settle around me. The building wasn't perfect, it never had been, but it was honest and it was ours. My grandmother's legacy wasn't the structure itself, it was the clarity to step away from people who mistook control for care, and the courage to protect what mattered even when it meant standing alone. If there was a lesson in all of this, it was simple. Families aren't defined by blood, but by the choices they make when integrity is tested. And sometimes the healthiest act of loyalty is refusing to follow someone down a path that harms everyone around them. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If you're still here, let me know where you're listening from. It means more than you know.